In 1519, one of the greatest cities on earth watched strangers emerge from the sea. They arrived on what looked like floating wooden mountains, wearing armor that gleamed beneath the Mexican sun, carrying weapons that thundered like the sky itself. And within just 2 years, the entire Aztec Empire would collapse, not after centuries of slow decline, not after generations of civil war. Millions lived under Aztec rule. Their armies dominated Mesoamerica. Their temples rose above, cities that rivaled anything in Europe. Their capital, Tenochtitlan, was so magnificent that the Spanish soldiers who first saw it thought they were dreaming. One of those soldiers, Bernal Diaz del Castillo, wrote in his memoir that when they crested the mountains and saw the city rising from the lake below, they stood in silence. Hardened men, veterans of war, speechless, and yet, a few hundred exhausted foreigners would trigger the destruction of everything. But here's what most people get wrong about this story. The Spanish did not conquer the Aztec Empire. The Spanish were the SPACs. The empire provided the fuel, decades of oppressed nations, accumulated hatred, and the burning desire of millions to watch Tenochtitlan fall. Because empires built on fear look invincible, right until the moment nobody wants to save them anymore. This is the real story of the Aztec collapse. And it begins, as all great collapses do, not with an invasion. It begins with an island no one else wanted. The Aztecs did not begin as conquerors. They began as refugees. According to their own oral history, half record, half myth, the Mexica people wandered for over 200 years before they found a home. They came from a mythical northern homeland called Aztlan. They were despised wherever they went. Other peoples drove them away, considered them barbaric, uncivilized, dangerous. They carried with them a god named Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird of the south, who spoke to their priests and told them to keep walking. He promised a homeland. He gave them a sign, an eagle, perched on a cactus, devouring a snake. In 1325, they found it. In the middle of Lake Texcoco, on a small marshy island nobody else wanted, a priest saw the eagle. They called the place Tenochtitlan, place of the prickly pear cactus. Beneath it today sits Mexico City. The location was both a blessing and a prison. Surrounded by enemies with no intention of letting these wanderers build anything permanent, the Mexica survived as mercenaries, warriors for hire, doing the dirty work more powerful states didn't want to do. They paid tribute. They were subjects, but they were learning. Every war they fought for someone else. They built expertise. Every tribute they paid, they memorized the vulnerabilities of the powerful. The transformation came in 1428. The Mexica formed the Triple Alliance with two neighboring city-states, Texcoco and Tlacopan. Together, they overthrew their overlords. And then they turned outward. What followed was one of the most rapid military expansions in pre-Columbian history. City after city fell. Some surrendered peacefully. Others were crushed. By the early 1500s, the empire covered over 80,000 square miles, incorporating over 500 city-states. Annual tribute flowing into Tenochtitlan included 200,000 cotton cloaks, hundreds of thousands of bushels of maize, gold, jade, live eagles, cacao, rubber. The city consumed the wealth of an entire region. Tenochtitlan was an engineering miracle. Built on an island and expanded through chinampas, artificial floating gardens made from layered aquatic plants and soil, the city grew outward into the lake. 3 massive causeways connected it to the mainland, each wide enough for 10 men to walk side by side. At its peak, between 200,000 and 300,000 people. One of the 5 largest cities on Earth. A freshwater aqueduct. A market at Tlatelolco where 60,000 people traded every single day. An organization that stunned even the Spanish, who had seen the markets of Europe. At the center rose the Templo Maya, a dual pyramid dedicated to Huitzilopochtli and the rain god Tlaloc, rebuilt 7 times, each new structure taller than the last. To the Europeans who finally saw it, it looked less like a city and more like something the gods had built. But wealth and architecture alone don't make an empire. What made the Aztec Empire run, and what would ultimately destroy it, was fear. Aztec warfare had a feature unlike any other military system in history. They did not fight to kill. They fought to capture. Aztec warriors were trained above all to take prisoners alive. Status and prestige were measured by the number of captives taken. A man who killed his enemy on the battlefield was considered wasteful. The goal was to bring them home, alive, hearts still beating, to be sacrificed to the gods. The Aztecs believed the gods had sacrificed themselves to create the world. Human blood was the debt owed to keep that world alive. Without sacrifice, the sun would stop. Crops would fail. Darkness would swallow everything. So they built an empire to guarantee the supply. The scale of this sacrifice is difficult to process. The dedication ceremony for the rebuilt Templo Maya in 1487 allegedly lasted 4 days. Prisoners stretched over the sacrificial stone in continuous succession. The skulls of victims were displayed on enormous racks called tzompantli. Spanish soldiers estimated one rack alone held over 130,000 skulls. Archaeological excavations at the Templo Maya have confirmed these structures existed. This was not just religion. It was a message. To every subject people, every potential enemy. This is what resistance looks like. This is what losing costs. For decades, the message worked. But the Aztec system had a structural problem that fear was papering over. Conquered peoples were not incorporated into the empire. They were taxed. Their young men were taken for sacrifice. Their resources were extracted. Their leaders were humiliated. They were subjects, not citizens. And the difference between those two things is the difference between an empire that survives a crisis and one that cannot. Rebellions became increasingly common. Wars more frequent. Maintaining control over such a massive territory required constant violence, which required more wars, which created more enemies, which required more violence. And there was one group the Aztecs had tried repeatedly to crush and failed, the Tlaxcalans. A fiercely independent civilization in the mountains east of Tenochtitlan, they had resisted Aztec expansion for decades. Rather than commit the full military force required to destroy them, the Aztecs had developed an arrangement called the Flower Wars, ritualized combat designed primarily to generate captives for sacrifice rather than to conquer territory. The Tlaxcalans remained free, surrounded by Aztec territory on all sides, blockaded, furious, humiliated, and waiting. Meanwhile, in 1502, Moctezuma II took the throne. He ruled during a period of growing instability. The empire was expanding too fast. Enemies surrounded it, and strange omens began unsettling. The capital, the sky burned with unexplained fire. A temple spontaneously caught flame. A comet appeared in daylight. The lake flooded without cause. And at night, people heard a woman's voice weeping through the city. "My children, we are lost." A civilization that believed the universe was fragile, that the gods were demanding, that disaster was always one failed sacrifice away. Such a civilization lives in permanent anxiety. And in 1519, the anxiety took human form. Hernan Cortés had disobeyed orders. The governor of Cuba had tried to stop the expedition. Cortés ignored him. If he returned home empty-handed, he faced disgrace, possibly execution. So failure was never an option. He landed on the Gulf Coast of Mexico in 1519 with 508 soldiers, 16 horses, and 14 cannons. He then did something that told you everything about the kind of man he was. He burned his own ships. No retreat. No escape. Forward or death. By all logic, the expedition should have collapsed immediately. The Aztecs outnumbered them by tens of thousands. The terrain was unfamiliar. The climate was hostile. They were thousands of miles from any reinforcement. But Cortés understood something Moctezuma did not. The Aztec Empire was not united. It was feared. And there is a profound difference between those two things. As Cortés moved inland, he encountered exactly what he suspected, tributary states boiling with resentment. The Totonacs joined him first. Then came the moment that truly changed the course of history. The Tlaxcalans. The initial battles were brutal. The Tlaxcalans fought ferociously, outnumbering the Spanish enormously. Cortés nearly lost. But the Spanish had advantages no Aztec army had encountered. Horses that terrified warriors who had never seen them, steel against obsidian, firearms that killed at impossible distances. After weeks of combat, the Tlaxcalan leadership made the most consequential decision in Mexican history. They switched sides. The logic was cold and simple. The Aztecs were their existential enemy. The Spanish were strange and powerful. The enemy of your enemy is your ally. If these strangers could help break Tenochtitlan, the Tlaxcalans would finally be free. The Tlaxcalan alliance transformed Cortés from the leader of a raiding party into a general commanding thousands. Every mile toward Tenochtitlan, more peoples joined. Former tributaries, old enemies of the empire, people who had watched family members dragged to the sacrificial stone. This is the truth most tellings bury. When Cortés arrived at the gates of Tenochtitlan, he was not leading a few hundred Spanish soldiers. He was leading an indigenous coalition that dwarfed his own forces, warriors who knew the terrain, spoke the languages, and burned with decades of accumulated fury. The Aztec Empire had spent a century manufacturing its own destroyers. Before reaching the capital, Cortés stopped at Cholula, one of the empire's great sacred cities. The Spanish were welcomed as guests. Then the massacre began. Thousands slaughtered in the city's main plaza. Whether Cortés genuinely believed a conspiracy was forming, or whether he wanted to send a message, historians still debate. The result was the same: terror. The road to Tenochtitlan was now wide open. In November 1519, the Spanish finally saw Tenochtitlan. Even hardened soldiers stood speechless. A giant city rising from the waters of Lake Texcoco, causeways stretching across the lake like stone arms, temples towering overhead, markets buzzing with tens of thousands of people, canals threading through the streets like veins. It looked less like a city and more like something the gods had built. And Moctezuma II walked out to meet them. Here's the story you've probably heard. Cortés arrived and the Aztecs believed he was the god Quetzalcoatl returning from the east. Moctezuma, paralyzed by religious awe, surrendered without a fight. The reality is more complicated, and far more human. The automatic identification of Cortés as Quetzalcoatl is largely a post-conquest construction, a narrative shaped by texts written years later, some by Spanish writers, others by indigenous scholars trying to make sense of a trauma that needed explaining. Why did the empire fall so fast? It must have been the will of the gods. What the historical record actually shows is genuine uncertainty from Moctezuma, followed by a fatal choice. When word reached him of strange beings on the coast, he did not immediately bow. He investigated. He sent ambassadors. He received reports. He deliberated. And by every military measure, he had the power to crush Cortés before the Spaniard ever reached the mountains. The Aztec forces vastly outnumbered the Spanish. The terrain favored the defenders. The logistics were completely on Moctezuma's side. And yet he hesitated. He sent more gifts, which Cortés read as tribute, as weakness. He sent warnings, which Cortés ignored. He did not attack when the Spanish were still small, still vulnerable, still crossing the lowlands. Why? Historians have argued this for 500 years. Some say genuine religious paralysis. Some say political calculation. Draw them into Tenochtitlan, observe them, then destroy them on home ground. Some say the Aztec political system, built on elite consensus, made fast, decisive action structurally impossible. The most likely answer, all of the above. A sophisticated ruler facing something genuinely unprecedented, with incomplete information and advisors who disagreed, chose the thing that always feels safe when facing the unknown. Delay. In a crisis, delay is a decision. And the decision to wait always benefits whoever is attacking. Moctezuma welcomed Cortés into the city. The Spanish were housed in a royal palace. Fed. Given access. Then Cortés made his move. In a breathtaking act of pure audacity, he seized Moctezuma, took the emperor of the most powerful empire in the Americas hostage inside his own palace. And unbelievably, it worked. For months, the Spanish controlled Tenochtitlan through Moctezuma. He spoke to his people on Cortés' behalf. He authorized the collection of gold. Whether from genuine belief in Spanish power, political calculation, or psychological collapse under captivity, Moctezuma cooperated. But the Aztec people were watching, and they were not Moctezuma. While Cortés temporarily left the city to deal with a rival Spanish force sent to arrest him, he placed his lieutenant Pedro de Alvarado in command. That decision nearly ended everything. During a major Aztec religious festival, Alvarado ordered a massacre inside the temple complex. Nobles, priests, celebrants, killed in enormous numbers while gathered for a sacred ceremony. The accounts differ on why. Some say Alvarado feared an attack was being planned. Others say it was greed for the gold and jewelry the nobles wore. Whatever the cause, the effect was instant. Tenochtitlan erupted. Barricades rose across the city. Warriors flooded the streets. When Cortés returned, he found the empire in open revolt. Desperate to calm the situation, the Spanish forced Moctezuma onto a rooftop to address his people. The emperor who had once commanded millions spoke, and his own subjects threw stones and spears at him. To them, he was no longer their ruler. He was a puppet, a traitor. Shortly after, Moctezuma was dead, killed by Spanish hands, by wounds from his own people, or both, depending on which account you believe. A ruler humiliated past the point of loyalty, abandoned by everyone. The Spanish knew they could not hold the city. So in the dead of night, they attempted to escape. And they made one fatal mistake. They carried too much gold. As the Spanish crossed the causeways in darkness, the alarm sounded. Aztec warriors attacked from rooftops, from canoes on the lake, from every direction at once. Chaos consumed the night. Soldiers drowned beneath the weight of stolen treasure they refused to drop. Others were dragged away alive, sacrificed on the Templo Mayor in full view of the retreating army, a message delivered in the most brutal language possible. Cortés lost hundreds of soldiers, most of his artillery, a devastating fraction of his Tlaxcalan allies. By some accounts, he sat under a tree on the mainland when it was over, and wept. The Spanish called it La Noche Triste, the night of sorrows. The Aztecs had won. The invaders were broken, fleeing, decimated. The city was theirs. And then, the invisible enemy arrived. While Cortés retreated and regrouped, smallpox swept through Tenochtitlan. A single infected member of a rival Spanish expedition, landing on the Gulf Coast months earlier, had introduced a pathogen to a population with zero immunity. No exposure, no resistance, no understanding of what was happening. People died in enormous numbers. Entire neighborhoods collapsed. Leadership broke down. And among the dead was the new emperor, Cuitlahuac. Cuitlahuac had been the man who organized the successful defense. The man who drove the Spanish out on the night of sorrows. He died of smallpox after 80 days in power. What happened to the Aztecs was not just a military defeat. The epidemics that swept the Americas following European contact would eventually kill between 50 and 90% of the indigenous population over the following century. It was the opening chapter of a biological catastrophe without precedent in human history. The disease did not work alone. It worked alongside everything else: the political fractures, the allied enemies, the leadership vacuum, killing the defenders and commanders simultaneously, at precisely the moment when unified resistance mattered most. Cortés rebuilt. New soldiers arrived. More indigenous allies joined. Former tributaries who had watched the night of sorrows and recalculated which side was going to win. Some saw the Spanish as liberators. Others simply saw an opportunity for revenge decades in the making. And Cortés did something that showed exactly why he was so dangerous. He built brigantines, small warships, dismantled them, carried them in pieces over the mountains, and reassembled them on Lake Texcoco. For the first time in its history, Tenochtitlan faced attack from the water. The lake that had always been its greatest defense became a trap. By 1521, Cortés returned with tens of thousands of native allies. This time, he came to destroy the city completely. The siege of Tenochtitlan lasted 7 to 5 days, and it was as brutal as anything recorded in the history of warfare. The Spanish and their allies cut the causeways, destroyed the freshwater aqueducts, blockaded the lake, then systematically leveled the city block by block, building by building, temple by temple, canal by canal. Inside, conditions became apocalyptic. The population that had survived smallpox was now starving. Food supply cut off. People ate leather, grass, whatever they could find. Bodies filled the streets. Contaminated water spread more disease. The lake that once made Tenochtitlan a miracle now made it a closed coffin. The Aztecs fought ferociously, street by street, house by house. Their new emperor, Cuauhtémoc, young and fierce, refused to yield. At several points, Aztec warriors captured Spanish soldiers and sacrificed them on the Templo Mayor in full view of the attacking army, a final declaration that the old world still existed, that the gods still demanded their due. Cuauhtémoc appealed to neighboring peoples for help. Some came. Most did not. The calculation had shifted for too many of them. Nobody wanted to be on the losing side. On August 13, 1521, it ended. Cuauhtémoc attempted to escape across the lake by canoe. He was captured by a Spanish brigantine. When brought before Cortés, he reportedly touched the dagger on Cortés' belt and said, "I have done everything I could to defend my people. Do with me what you will." The city fell silent. Tenochtitlan, one of the greatest cities the world had ever seen, had been reduced to rubble. Its population decimated by war, disease, and starvation. The Spanish tore down the temples and used their stones to build a cathedral. The codices, the painted books containing Aztec history, astronomy, law, and religion, were burned in their thousands by priests who believed they were the devil's work. And entire civilizations recorded knowledge, gone in fires that took less time to light than the knowledge had taken to accumulate. Cuauhtémoc was kept alive for years as a political prisoner. In 1525, on a march through the jungle to Honduras, Cortés had him executed, allegedly for plotting rebellion. The last emperor of the Aztecs died at Spanish hands, far from his city, for years after it fell. On its ruins, the Spanish built Mexico City, which is where it stands today. The Spanish brought steel. They brought gunpowder. They brought disease. But the Aztec Empire had already spent decades building the conditions for its own destruction. And when the final siege began, many of the men destroying Tenochtitlan were not Spaniards. They were the empire's own former subjects, the people it had taxed, humiliated, sacrificed, and terrorized for 100 years. That is the real story of this collapse. 3 things actually destroyed the Aztec Empire, and none of them is simply Hernan Cortés. First, the architecture of fear. An empire that rules through terror cannot build the loyalty that saves it in a crisis. Every captive sacrificed on the Templo Mayor was also a future enemy soldier. Every tribute extracted was also a future defection. The system was brilliant in peacetime. In war, it collapsed, because when the moment came, millions of people decided the Aztecs were worth more destroyed than saved. Second, the failure of leadership at the critical moment. Moctezuma II was not a weak man, he was a sophisticated ruler who managed a complex empire for years. But he faced something unprecedented and chose hesitation. In a crisis, hesitation is itself a decision. And the decision to wait always benefits whoever is attacking. Third, the invisible catastrophe. Smallpox reminds us that the most decisive forces in history are often the ones nobody sees coming. The Aztec military was formidable. The city's defenses were extraordinary. None of it mattered against a pathogen they had no name for. Empires fall not just to challenges they can see, but to the ones they cannot imagine. The Aztecs believed the sun needed human blood to keep moving across the sky, that without sacrifice, it would stop. Darkness would come. The entire universe would collapse. The entire empire, the wars, the pyramids, the markets, the terror, the blood, was built on that premise. On August 13th, 1521, the sun rose over a ruined city. It kept moving. It had never needed them at all. Empires rarely collapse only because enemies attack from outside. More often, they collapse because the foundations beneath them have already begun to rot. The Aztecs looked invincible. Their capital amazed the world. Their armies terrified millions. But fear was not enough to save them. And in just 2 years, one of the most powerful civilizations in the Americas disappeared forever. This is the 4th episode in our series on the downfall of empires, nations, armies, and companies. If you want more stories like this, subscribe, and tell me which downfall we should cover next. History is full of giants who believed they were untouchable, until they were not.